Hello students, I'm coming to you with the next video lecture on Chapter 2, which covers evidence-based practice. This is part 2 in this series. In the last video lecture, we discussed the difference between the evidence-based practice process and the scientific method or the social work research process. We also discussed the meaning of evidence-based practice. In addition, we discussed the connection between EBP and critical thinking, as well as EBP and career-long learning. And finally, we discussed steps 1 and 2 in the evidence-based practice process, which is related to formulating an answerable practice question and conducting a search for evidence. In this video lecture, we will discuss steps 3 through 6 in the EBP process, and we will end by discussing real-world obstacles in implementing EBP in practice. And I like to end with this conversation simply because I think that it's important for students to understand that although engaging in the evidence-based practice process is an expectation, not only just from me as your instructor, but also from the profession at large. And so I think while we talk about the importance of engaging in EBP, it's also important to talk about what the realities are in terms of implementing EBP in practice and what you can expect to be up against once you do find yourself engaging in this process. And so here again are the steps that we will discuss in this video lecture, which are step 3, which involves critically appraising the relevant studies you find. Step 4, which involves determining which research-supported intervention is most appropriate for your particular client. Step 5, which involves applying the chosen intervention. And step 6, which involves providing evaluation and feedback. And here again, I just want to remind you that just like in the last video lecture, we must keep in mind the fluidity of this process, and that although it is being presented in a very linear fashion for the purposes of instruction, the process is indeed very fluid. In terms of learning objectives, by the end of this video lecture, you should be able to identify and describe steps 3 through 6 in the EBP process, explain why it is important to include evaluation as a last phase in the evidence-based practice process, and identify feasibility obstacles to implementing EBP and how to alleviate them. So we are still in Unit 1. We have already covered Chapter 1, which is related to why study research. We are now in Chapter 2, which is related to evidence-based practice. And in Chapter 3, we will talk about factors influencing the research process, which in particular, we will really hone in and focus on the role of theory in the research process, in the social work research process specifically. And then finally, to conclude this unit, we will discuss Chapter 4, which is related to quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods of inquiry. So let's talk about step 3 in the evidence-based practice process, which is critically appraising the relevant studies that you find. So we know that there is a vast range in the quality of published studies evaluating the effectiveness of various interventions. And as we talked about in Chapter 1, there is a need to evaluate or critique the quality of the research that we find. While there are many excellent studies out there, there are also many that violate some key methodological principles that comprise the quality of the evidence provided. The research methods and research design concepts you'll need to know to critically appraise studies will be discussed throughout the course of this semester. We will also discuss the criteria for critically appraising evidence alongside each of the designs for evaluating programs in practice. So once we get to Unit 4, we will start to look at the research design And alongside each design, we will look at ways to critically appraise that design. And the reason why I teach this in this way is that the way we critically appraise and critique of any given study really depends on the research design that is being employed. And so I find that it's most helpful to talk about the research design and the particulars around that design. And then once you understand the design itself, then we can start talking about how do we critically appraise that design. Because what you'll find and what you'll come to see is that, for example, like a survey research design has its own set of sort of unique features. And so when we think about survey research designs, there are certain questions that we need to ask when we're critically appraising that design that is different from an experimental study, right? And so in my experience, I found that the best way to teach this is to talk about the design alongside how to critique the design. And so that's the way that we will proceed in this class. So it'll be a while before we start to talk about critical appraisal because we need to get through units 2 and 3 first, right? And once we finish this unit and we get through units 2 and 3, then we'll start talking about research designs. And that's where you will start to see the critical appraisal piece come in. Okay, so it might take us a while to get there, but we'll get there. So I don't want you to think that we're not going to talk about critical appraisal. We will, but it's intentionally placed in unit 4. Okay, and so as you'll see here, we'll talk about experimental designs in chapter 11. And then alongside that, we'll talk about how do we critically appraise instruments. Experiments. And then we'll talk about quasi-experimental designs. And then alongside that, we'll talk about how do you critically appraise a quasi-experimental design. We'll talk about single case designs. And then alongside that, how do you critically appraise single case designs? And so on and so forth, okay? And so it's very important to be sure that we're talking about critical appraisal alongside the design itself. Otherwise, it can be a little bit confusing. Okay, so I just want you to know where we're headed. We're not there yet, but we'll get there. And so this is the text that I'm pulling from. What I found with your text, the Rubin and Babby text, which is the main text for this course, is that it only provides information about the research design itself. It doesn't necessarily provide a great deal of information about how to critically appraise the design. And so I was able to find this text, which is called Practitioner's Guide to Using Research for Evidence-Based Practice. This is an excellent text that I recommend to all of my students as a supplemental text for this course. It's not in the course syllabus, but I highly recommend it because it gives you a specific set of criteria to look for in every single type of study design that we cover in this course. And so I am supplementing the main text for this course with information from this text. And so I'll provide those chapters for you, and they're not required reading, but if you really want to immerse yourself in this whole idea of what it means to critically appraise studies, I would recommend reading these chapters. As we talk about each design, you can read the chapter on how to critically appraise the design, and that'll give you that much more information, and it will definitely enrich your learning experience if you choose to read those chapters. And so we won't get into the particulars of critical appraisal now, but we'll get there, as I mentioned. And so now let's move on to step 4. So step 4 involves determining which research-supported intervention is most appropriate for your particular client. And so here I just want to discuss some of the considerations for how you go about determining what is most appropriate. One of the things that you want to take into consideration is the quality of the evidence found, okay? And so that's when we start to look at it and do the assessment of each of the studies that we find based on the specific set of criteria that we will cover and we will talk about in Unit 4. So we want to really look at the quality of the evidence. We also want to look at the context in which the intervention in the research studies that we've reviewed, in what context were they delivered, and to what extent is that context in that study or in those studies consistent with our practice context? So this is another question that we must ask ourselves when we are considering or determining what is most appropriate is we want to look at this issue of context. In what context was the intervention in the study we are reading? In what context was it delivered in that study? And comparing that to our context and determining, is it going to be feasible? We also want to take into consideration the characteristics of the sample in the research studies and the extent to which they are similar to our clients' characteristics. Okay, and so typically all studies will include some information on the demographics of the population being studied. And so we can look at the demographics in that research study and we can compare it to our clients' characteristics or demographics to see if there's a match. We also want to take into consideration the cost of implementing the intervention within our agency context. For some interventions, there's a cost associated because some interventions have certain manuals that go along with them that we need to purchase and different things that we need. Some interventions are manualized. It's what we call a manualized intervention. And a lot of times in order to acquire the manuals that are necessary for implementing the intervention, it comes with a cost, right? And so we need to assess whether that is a cost that our agency can expend, okay? And so we want to take that into consideration. Also, the complexity and feasibility of the intervention. So we want to look at how easy is the intervention to implement. So we always want to be sure that whatever it is we're proposing to do is feasible for our agency context. Remember that evidence-based practice happens within a larger environmental and organizational context. And so we always want to keep that in mind. And we want to think about this issue of complexity because folks may need to be trained on how to most appropriately implement the intervention. Perhaps the individuals that are going to be involved in implementation don't necessarily have the skill that is required to effectively implement the intervention. We also want to think about, and this is what I just mentioned or alluded to, is the technical support and training needs that are necessary for responsibly and ethically implementing the intervention with fidelity. And this part is critically important, is that we do have a responsibility and an ethical obligation to ensure that we have the skill necessary or that we are competent, right? So this is a part of our core values, is that we must exercise competency in our delivery of services. And so we want to make sure that when we're delivering an intervention, that we're doing so in such a way that is responsible and ethical, and that we're able to reasonably implement the intervention with fidelity. And what this term fidelity means is that we want to implement the intervention in the way that it was intended. So whatever the way is, whatever the intention is for the intervention, or whatever those who conceived of the intervention, in whatever way that they say is the way in which the intervention should be implemented, is the way that we need to actually implement it in our practice, okay? And so we want to be sure that we are implementing interventions with fidelity, or in other words, with integrity, right? So we want to be sure that we are maintaining the integrity of the intervention as it was originally conceived. We want to also take into consideration the client's culture, values, characteristics, and preferences. So we talked about this in the last video, is that in our determination of what is most appropriate, we can never forget the client, right? So EBP is very much so a client-centered process. And so we want to take into consideration all of these things with regard to our clients as we're determining what's most appropriate as well. And finally, your own knowledge or practice wisdom of the client system. So we know that this is also a part of the EBP process, is that your practice wisdom and what you've come to learn in your practice experience is a resource, right? And so we can't just necessarily throw that out of the window either, right? So we want to honor that as well. And so that's also another point that we take into consideration when we're determining the most appropriate intervention. So as you can see, there are many things to take into consideration here, okay? And so, but these are some of the main things to keep in mind. Step 5, we want to apply or implement the chosen intervention. And so some of the considerations for applying the chosen intervention is, as I mentioned, obtaining training in the chosen intervention, obtaining any readings and any treatment manuals or curricula required to successfully implement the chosen intervention. We also want to seek out supervision and consultation from someone who has experience with implementing the intervention. If it's something that involves a great deal of complexity and a high level of skill in a particular area, we may want to seek out supervision and consultation to ensure that we are implementing that intervention with the highest level of fidelity and integrity. And finally, we want to formulate in collaboration with the client measurable treatment goals that can be evaluated to determine the effectiveness of the intervention. So as we are applying the intervention, before we actually apply it, we want to make sure that we've done our due diligence to set some treatment goals with our clients so that we are in a position to evaluate those goals at any point in the intervention. Remember in the last video, I mentioned that we might evaluate midway through, right? We might evaluate at the end, but the key is setting some goals up front in collaboration with the client so that when the time comes, we are prepared to engage in that step 6, which is the evaluate and provide feedback. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're doing that. And so I just want to say give a quick note on the science behind implementation. And so there is a science to moving research into practice or implementing research into practice, and it is referred to as implementation science. So this is a whole field of work out there that many researchers focus on, is how do we most effectively move research into practice? How do we get folks to take this up? Right? And so it is the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practices into routine practice, and hence to improve the quality and effectiveness of health services. And this says health services, but it's also very relevant to social work services as well. And so this really is a scientific study, an area of scientific study. How do we systematically promote this uptake of research findings in a way that leads to sustained change over time? And so here are some of the things that sort of bear on implementation of research and practice. These are some of the domains that we have to consider when we think about, because sometimes implementing EBP and utilizing research and practice can sometimes be an uphill battle. And there are many different factors that we have to take into consideration. And so we want to, and all of these things bear on the implementation of a particular intervention. And so we want to take into consideration the individuals that are involved, or the individuals who have a role to play in the implementation process, whether it's service providers, managers, policymakers, whoever the beneficiaries might be of these services that we're providing. We have to take those individuals into consideration. We also have the larger outer setting, which is the economic context, social and political context as well, that we have to take into consideration as it relates to looking at why it may or may not be difficult to implement certain interventions in practice. And then we also have to look at the inner setting, which is the context within the organization implementing the intervention. So what is the culture of the agency context? What's the structure? What are the networks, right? And then the actual process itself for implementation, right? So that's an area of study, is looking at the process. How are we going about implementation of this intervention? Are there kinks in the process that we need to consider? What are the methods used to facilitate adoption of a particular intervention? And we have to look at that. What are the strategies? What are the activities that are emerging along the way as we're trying to best and most effectively implement a particular intervention? All of these things are at play, right? And so oftentimes we wonder, what is the struggle, right? Why is it so difficult to get my agency to take up this new intervention or this new research that we're learning about, this particular intervention that's most effective? Why is it so difficult, right? And so these are some of the things that we have to take into consideration, because all of these things bear on the implementation process. And so here are some definitions of each of the domains, just in case you're interested. This kind of gives you a better sense of each of those domains that we just discussed. So now let's talk about step 6, which is the final step in the process, which is providing evaluation and feedback. So here are some considerations for evaluating the outcomes of the chosen intervention. So we want to make sure that we're tracking client progress over time, okay? Also that we're measuring client outcomes and determining intervention effectiveness. And not only that, but that we're disseminating our findings for others for the purpose of communication and replication. And so we're going to talk about one research design, which is called the single case research design. And this design tends to be very useful for the practitioner because it's not about studying several cases of individuals. It really is a design that allows you to focus on a single case or a single client. And it gives you some insight into how you can track the outcomes of a single client in a way that is very systematic and research-based. And so we want to be sure that we're documenting this process and we're communicating this process outwardly with others, even if we're not necessarily publishing it, but we're sharing it with others within our agency context or maybe even within the community, right? And so this is a way that we can, a research design that can be very feasible to the social work practitioner. And so we want to make sure that when we're evaluating our clients that we're documenting it and that we're sharing it with others so that we can establish some best practices. And so to do this, you must select the right assessment instruments. So just like research studies, not all assessment tools are created equally, okay? There are several considerations that need to be taken into account in selecting the right tools to measure client outcomes. And so here are 6 key considerations in critically appraising and selecting standardized assessment instruments. And so I got this information from the textbook that I just mentioned. So I recommend, and I have the chapter on this, the chapter that covers critically appraising and assessing standardized assessment instruments. And so I will provide you with this chapter if you'd like to read it for yourself. But this is just a synopsis of some of the key considerations that are brought to bear in this particular text as it relates to how do we go about, so we talk a lot about critically appraising research studies, but we also have to think about critically appraising assessment tools, okay? And so some of the things that we want to look for in our assessment tools is the tool reliable? Is it valid? Is it feasible? Is it sensitive? Is it culturally sensitive? And is it what are the characteristics of the sample with which the tool was developed on? Okay, so typically in measurement studies or studies that are designed to test and develop measurement instruments, there is a particular sample that is employed in that study in order to test that instrument. So we want to look at what are the characteristics of the sample that was used in order to develop and test the assessment instrument that we are looking to utilize. So there are these are just some of the key things that we need to take into consideration as we assess or as we critically appraise assessment tools. And so more specifically, here are some questions just to give you a better sense of each of these key considerations. Again, is it reliable? Is it valid? Is it sensitive to relatively small but important client changes over time? So this is what we mean by sensitivity. Is the tool able to pick up on these changes with the client over time? Is it sensitive enough to pick up on these relatively small changes, small incremental changes that we might see with clients over a period of time? Is the tool culturally sensitive? So is it relevant and applicable to the client's cultural background? Is it feasible for use in practice, right? So sometimes measurement tools or assessment tools can be very long, right? And so depending on the type of client and the client's level of education or intellect, we might not want to choose a very rigorous or jargon heavy and long tool, right? So we have to take into consideration who our client is in the selection of our assessment tools as well. And if we're dealing with children or adolescents, we want to make sure that the tool is relatively short. So we want to think about the feasibility of the tool as well. And then what are the characteristics of the sample used to empirically test or norm the original instrument? And how different are their characteristics from those of your client, right? So when we look at assessment tools, again, there's a sample that's usually used to test the assessment tool, to test the integrity of the tool. But that sample that's used to test the integrity of the tool may be different than the characteristics of your clients, right? So we want to look at that to see how much of a match there is between the two. And so there are three main sources for locating standardized assessment tools. And I emphasize standardized, that's what we're talking about here. These are the assessment tools that have been developed and created by researchers, but we're also going to talk momentarily about tools that you can create yourself in practice, okay? And so three main sources for locating standardized assessment instruments is publishing houses, such as the Psychological Assessment Resources. This is a resource for, or a publishing house for developing standardized assessment instruments. We also have reference or source books, such as the Measures for Clinical Practice and Research. And finally, the research literature. So we have some studies within the research literature that focus on understanding the relationships between certain variables. And then we also have what we call measurement construction studies. So there are some studies that just focus on the development and construction of assessment tools or measurement tools that individuals can use either in research or in practice. And so these are three sources. And so here's just a picture of what the website looks like for the Psychological Assessment Resources. So this is the publishing house that I mentioned. This is one resource, and I've put the link here in the bottom. So if you want to go and search and look around there, you can. I believe many of the tools on this website are at a cost, but it just at least gives you a sense of what's out there. Here's the reference or source book. And again, it's called Measures for Clinical Practice and Research. And so you can purchase this book and utilize it in your practice. This can be a desk reference for you that you can always refer to. It has various different measures that you can use with couples, families, and children. Okay, and so this is another resource as well in terms of locating standardized tools. And then finally, we have the research literature. As I mentioned, measurement construction studies. So these are several studies of measurement tools that I have utilized in my own work, okay? And so we have the inventory of father involvement, which is a measure of the involvement of fathers in the lives of their children. We also have the development of a parenting alliance inventory. So this particular measure measures the extent to which parents have a positive alliance in terms of caring for their children or parenting their children in a way that is harmonious. So to what extent, it looks at various different aspects of the alliance between parents and to what extent that alliance is either positive or negative. And then finally, we have the Father Presence Questionnaire, which is a measure of the subjective experience of being fathered. And so there is a subscale within this questionnaire that I've used. It's called the father's, it looks at the father's relationship with his own father. And so there are several different aspects of father presence that are addressed in this questionnaire, but the one that I'm most familiar with is the one that looks at how the father, how the individual perceives their relationship with their own father. And so these are a couple of different studies that I have found in the research literature that include measurement tools that can be used either in research or in practice. And so when you locate assessment tools from any of these sources, there are a few things that you should look for. One is you want to know something about the reliability and validity of the instrument, and we call this the psychometric properties. And we'll talk about when we get to, I believe it's chapter 9, which covers measurement, we'll talk about reliability and validity. And so we refer to these things as psychometric properties. And so you want to know something about the reliability and validity of the tool. This tells you how sound the tool is. You also want to know something about the scoring instructions. And so oftentimes certain scales that we use require scoring. And so, and we can't just guess this, right? Like we can't just come up with a way to score it ourselves. We need to know what the instructions are for scoring, because some scales can be very intricate in terms of how you go about scoring them. So we want to make sure that we know that. And then also we want some background information on the sample that the instrument was tested with. So we want to know a little bit about who was this sample that was used to test the instrument, okay? Because again, we need to compare that sample to our client population to see where there might be similarities or differences. And then also we want a citation, okay, for the original study, and sometimes for studies that have used the instrument as well. So we want to have that original citation from whatever the study was that where the assessment tool was created. So we want that original citation from that study with the original tool, if possible. If we can get that, we want to have the citation for that original study. So not some secondary source, but we want the original primary source if we can find it. And then also it helps to have, or to take a look at, or to have other studies that have used the tool. So that would be more secondary sources that we can look at to see how the tool has functioned with other researchers or other clinicians that have used the tool in their practice or in their research. That kind of gives us a little bit more information about the tool. If we're able to find studies that are perhaps similar and that include similar client populations and give some information about how the tool has functioned within their context. So as much background information as we can have on that assessment tool, the better. And here are some other resources that you can refer to in terms of locating assessment instruments, such as the Health and Psychological Instruments database, the Mental Measurements Yearbook, and the APA Psych tests. In addition, our librarians, we have a librarian that's assigned specifically to us. Her name is Sine Wood, and she has put together a library guide that provides some additional insight on how to go about searching for assessment tools as well. So these are some other resources that you can use if you just happen to be interested in this topic and want to better understand what assessment tools are out there. This is another set of resources for you. I want to say a little bit about some of the ways in which you can go about monitoring client progress that is beyond the standardized assessment tool. So I mentioned that you have your standardized assessment tools or scales that are created by trained researchers. And then you also have your assessment tools that are very individualized for your client and that are typically created in collaboration between the practitioner and the client. And so two ways of monitoring client progress that are very practitioner and client driven are behavioral recording forms and individualized rating scales. So let's talk about those. So the first one we have here is the behavioral recording form. And in this form, it gives a sense of the frequency or the number of times the behavior or cognition occurred. And so this might be a very brief, quick assessment that you can ask your client to do. And it's very simple, right? It's not as complicated as some of the standardized assessment tools that are out there. It's it's intended to be a very simple way of getting a quick assessment from the client, especially if it's going to be something that you're asking them to do every day. Like, let's just say you're asking them to track a particular behavior for maybe every day for maybe 2 weeks, right? So if you're asking them to do that and you expect for them to do so consistently, then it's of benefit to both you and them that you make it as simple as possible, because you don't want to make it complex. The more complex you make it, the less likely you are to get accurate data, okay? And so if you do it in a way that's very simple, it makes it very easy for everyone, and it increases the accuracy of the data that you get back. And so this is just an example of, and this can be for any problem or outcome, right? So you can tweak this for any problem or outcome that you're trying to track with your client. And so with this particular form, you can look at frequency, or you can look at duration. Okay, so the number of minutes a particular behavior or cognition lasted. Okay, so this is very similar to the first form that I just showed, except one looks at frequency and the other one looks at duration. And then finally, we have the individualized daily rating scale. So, and again, this is also something that is co-constructed by the practitioner and the client. And so here, this particular form is for depressed mood, okay? But you can alter this to fit any outcome that you're trying to track. And so you're just simply asking the client to put the date and to tell you on each day where they are in terms of their depressed mood or their level of depression for the day. And so again, this is intended to be a very rapid, very quick assessment that's very, very simple to individualize and to track consistently over an extended period of time. And then we have here the standardized scale. So, and this is what we just talked about in terms of standardized assessment tools. So this is just an example, which is the perceived stress scale. And this is something that's created by trained researchers, right? And so as you can see here, it's a little bit more cumbersome in terms of completing. Like, this is definitely not something that you'd want to ask a client to complete on a daily basis. Okay, this might be like more of a pre-post kind of thing where you give the perceived stress scale prior to the implementation of an intervention. You go through the intervention and then you use this same scale again post-intervention, okay? And so I definitely wouldn't recommend asking to a client to complete this on a daily basis, because I think with each day, the accuracy would probably decrease every day that they've been asked to complete it. And so we're definitely concerned about not just getting data from our clients in order to better understand what they're experiencing, but we also need to be concerned with the accuracy of the data that we get. And so I would recommend, again, doing a standardized scale pre and post, and then using the simpler forms of assessment like the individualized daily rating scale and the behavioral forms in between, sort of a daily basis kind of thing that's very quick and rapid and easy, okay? And so you can use a combination of all of these assessments over the course of an intervention. But you have to really think about your assessment plan, right? And figure out how you're gonna go about assessing, okay? And so these are options that you can use in the development of your assessment plan. And that's something you want to do toward the beginning or in the beginning of the intervention. When you're thinking about whatever your treatment goals are with your client, you want to think about how to assess those goals. And so these are some of the ways in which you can go about assessing. And so once you decide on whatever those treatment goals are, then you can figure out, well, how am I going to assess? What is going to be my plan for assessment? Okay. And so these are some tools that you can use in making that determination. Finally, I want to end by talking about real world obstacles to implementing EBP in practice. So we've talked about all 6 steps in the EBP process, and I want to end this discussion by talking about some of the real world barriers and obstacles to implementing EBP in practice, because we know that it's important to do this. We talk a lot about this and why we are held responsible in our profession for doing this. But what we don't often talk about is what we're up against in doing so and what the real world barriers are. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it is impossible, but it's important to go in with our eyes wide open, knowing what we might expect to face in the process. And so the NASW Code of Ethics requires social workers to keep current with critically examine and apply research to practice. Specifically, it states social workers should critically examine and keep current with emerging knowledge relevant to social work. Social workers should routinely review the professional literature, and participate in continuing education relevant to social work practice and social work ethics. And finally, the Code of Ethics also states that social workers should base practice on recognized knowledge, including empirically based knowledge, relevant to social work and social work ethics. So I pulled this quote from a study that I reviewed in preparation from this lecture. And what was stated is that despite the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics emphasis on research-based service, the majority of social workers do not appear to draw on research findings to inform their practice. And so what is the reason for that? Why is it that although we know that this is a professional obligation, why is it that most social workers still don't engage in this activity? And so some of the reasons that were cited include lack of resources, and those resources include time, access, and funding, right? So a lot of times access to research literature, perhaps your agency context doesn't have access to research databases that you need in order to find relevant research studies. Perhaps you don't have the time, right? You're so inundated with your caseload that you don't have the time to dedicate to actually remaining current with regard to research and evidence. And perhaps you don't have the necessary funding. Also suspicion, right? So the reality is that some social workers are suspicious about EBP and believe that EBP is more cumbersome in the process, and it doesn't necessarily change client outcomes, or actually gets in the way of making progress with clients, or that it isn't necessarily feasible, right, for their practice setting. And so there are a number of attitudes and beliefs with regard to EBP that can also be a barrier. Also, lack of fit, right? So there might be some client populations that are not represented in the literature. And so it becomes very hard to find literature that really speaks to that client population, or that's really consistent with the characteristics, values, and preferences of the clients that we serve. So maybe we search the literature and we just can't find anything that quite fits, okay? And so that could also be a barrier. And so that's the reason why we have to continue to conduct research in areas that are understudied, is because that is the case, that there are many, many gaps in the literature with regard to certain populations of individuals. And then also lack of knowledge in terms of research skills, training, and supervision. So these are some of the barriers with regard to the use of EBP in practice. And I just wanted to share this with you. This is also from the study that I mentioned in the last video lecture, where we're looking at the use of EBP in practice with master's level social workers. And so I'm not going to read through all of this, but in your own time, you can kind of get a sense of what some of the attitudes are towards evidence-based practice, and some of the questions that we asked to get at attitudes, and to try to understand folks' attitudes around EBP. And so some of the questions that we asked is that EBP is nothing more than a way to cut treatment costs, right? So this gets at folks' thoughts or attitudes about the use of EBP. Also, EBP helps improve client outcomes, or engaging in EBP hinders the use of practitioner judgment, right? So these are some of the thoughts or beliefs that some folks might hold, although we see that most people strongly disagreed with this, okay? Also, that practitioners who engage in the EBP process show greater concern for client well-being than practitioners who do not engage in EBP, or that engaging in the EBP process makes practice too mechanistic, okay? So these are just some of the questions that were asked with regard to attitude. And as you can see, the sentiment is generally positive, right? So it's not so much the attitudes per se that are a problem, right? So it's because as social work practitioners, we're trained to understand the importance of EBP in practice. So generally speaking, most folks see EBP in a positive light, and they see the value of EBP. But there are some other things at play that explain the reason why, even though we have this positive regard for EBP, why it still isn't happening to the extent that it should, right? So it's not so much attitude. There's generally a positive regard, but then the question becomes, if it's not attitude, then what is it, right? So then we look at actual behaviors, because there's a difference between one's attitude towards something and their actual behaviors of what they actually do, okay? And so some of the behaviors that we looked at were, I use the internet to search for the best research evidence to guide my practice, or I read about research evidence to guide my practice decisions, okay? And so now we kind of see where things kind of start to even out in terms of where the data fall within each category. And so even with regard to this first question, we see that it's kind of almost 50-50 in the sense that some report only some of the time using the internet to search for research evidence, and then others report very often or very often, right? And so we're beginning to see some distinction here and some variation, because there wasn't much variation as it related to attitudes. But now when we start talking about behaviors, that's when we see a bit more differentiation among these categories. And so the next question we ask is, I read about research evidence to guide my practice decisions. And so again, here almost 50-50 in terms of some saying I do this some of the time and others saying I do this often or very often. And so I just bring this up to help you to understand, again, where the barriers are. And as we can see here, and again, this is only a sample of 258 individuals in the state of Texas, so we can't generalize to anyone beyond the state of Texas, but it's still telling, and it still gives us some insight into where the barriers are in terms, and why it is that we know that we need to do this. And we have this positive regard about it because of everything we've been told in our educational settings about the importance of EBP. But when we actually get out there into the field, that's a horse of a different color, right? We start to really see the trappings, right? And what the realities are, because it's easier said than done, right? And so this gives some insight into that. And so solutions for promoting EBP. So one solution to promoting EBP in practice is the development of agency-university partnerships. And this is where university researchers in schools of social work successfully collaborate with agencies to support the EBP process. And so as I mentioned in the last video lecture, ideally, what we want to be doing as researchers and practitioners is we want to be in collaboration with one another. And unfortunately, this doesn't always happen to the extent that it should. Oftentimes we're very siloed, and sometimes practitioners think that researchers are off limits to them. But I'm here to tell you that there are many, many researchers that want to partner with agencies. And they want to engage in what is referred to as community-based participatory research. They want to engage with the community. They want to do this agency-based work because it gives more relevance to research, so that we're not just sitting back and thinking of what we think matters, right? But we are actually in conversation and dialogue with practitioners who are the ones that are on the ground doing the work, okay? And so that is a value, that is always a value to researchers. And so researchers are not off limits to you as practitioners. And so the more that you can seek out those collaborations, researchers can aid in that process of promoting EBP in practice, because researchers have the research skills that are necessary to do so, and they can lend those skills to practitioners. And then we can also draw on your practice wisdom and clinical knowledge and expertise as well as we engage in the research process. So this whole idea of agency-university partnership is what we're going to discuss as it relates to the case study that we're going to talk about. And the title of that case study is called Becoming Evidence-Based, a social work agency's effort to move research into practice. And so this particular case study will give you an idea of what this looks like and what the practitioners and the researchers involved in this process what they had to go through in order to try to move research into practice. And so this gives you a really good picture of what the realities are and what all is involved and what the challenges are around trying to implement EBP in practice. And so we'll talk about that case study in the next class as it relates to thinking about how we go about promoting EBP in practice. So in summary, in this video lecture, we have covered chapter 2, which talks about evidence-based practice. And we specifically have covered steps 3 through 6 in the EBP process. And we have ended this video series with talking about real-world obstacles to implementing EBP in practice. This is the point at which I invite you to check for your understanding of these concepts. You can do this in one of 3 ways, which is to complete this form here on the left and click submit. You might also copy and paste the link on the right into your browser or scan the QR code with your cell phone. I hope this has been helpful and I look forward to seeing you in the next class.